Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight for our event hosted by the Scholar Strategy Network and our co-sponsors, the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, the Department of Political Science, the Osher Lifelong Institute of Learning, and the Ingram Commons. And so the title of the event, the 2016 election, its consequences, there certainly are consequences, aren't there? So we're here tonight to talk about this. I first want to tell you a little bit about the Scholar Strategy Network. My name is Carolyn Heinrich. I'm a professor of public policy, education, and economics here at Vanderbilt University, and I'm the co-director of the Tennessee Regional Network of the Scholar Strategy Network. And the Scholar Strategy Network is based at Harvard University, but it was started with some important objectives, and that is to try to provide unbiased expertise to both policymakers and civic organizations, and also through events like this, to bring knowledge and expertise to the public and engage with the public and have these kinds of discussions with you. So as we know, America faces many pressing problems and needs, and the Scholar Strategy Network wants to promote meaningful debates as well as sound policies to address these issues and needs. It furthers these goals by connecting policymakers with academic experts like those we have on the panel tonight, who can help both craft and promote research-based or evidence-based policies. And it's going to be very important going forward, as we know. The Scholar Strategy Network is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, nationwide association of university-based scholars who are dedicated to improving public policy and strengthening democracy. So currently we have, we're based in 43 states. We have 189 universities engaged, 735 scholars who are formally members, and 24 regional chapters, of which the Tennessee is one of them, and one of our newer ones. We are looking always to outreach and bring more scholars into our network, as well as to make you aware of what we're doing. If you go to the Scholar Strategy Network webpage, you can see, yes, you can see policy briefs, latest briefs, and so very up to date, staying on the current issues. For example, most recently, the Scholar Strategy Network is very focused on the Affordable Care Act and what the implications of potential coming changes to that act, of which we're quite certain there are going to be some. But tonight, we're going to have a little bit of a broader discussion, and we're very fortunate to have 4 wonderful experts with us to share their knowledge on some very important issues. So I'm going to introduce each of these experts tonight, all 4 of them right now, and then we're going to start off with some questions, which our scholars will discuss, and then we're trying to move as quickly as possible to open up to discussion with you. Just so you know, there's a mic in each of the center rows here. Once we get to that portion of tonight's event where we will invite your questions, we'll ask you to line up behind those mics. And then it'll be very important that you only speak when you're in front of the mic, because this is being live streamed, and that's how we'll be able to hear you publicly as well. So let me introduce our speakers. We're very pleased to have Dr. Jacob Hacker, who flew in today. He is the director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies and the Stanley B. Reiser Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Hacker is an expert on the politics of U.S. health and social policy. He's the author of numerous books. I'm just going to tell you a little about his most recent books. In 2015, he published American Amnesia: How the War on Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Prosper. Winner Takes All Politics: How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. The Great Risk Shift: The New Economic Insecurity and the Decline of the American Dream. He also has a recent article, which you might look at in the June 2016 issue of the New Republic, that I think you would find very interesting. It's entitled "The Split: 19 Reasons Democrats Will Remain Divided and What It Means for the Party's Future." So in addition to his abundant scholarly work, he's a board member of the Century Foundation, the Economic Policy Institute, the American Prospect. He is one of our steering committee members of the Scholar Strategy Network, so Jacob has been a very important contributor to the mission of the Scholar Strategy Network. We're very fortunate to have him here, and he's also a former junior fellow of the Harvard Society of Fellows. Our next two, or down at the end, is Marc Hetherington. He's a professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. He studies the American electorate with a particular focus on the polarization of public opinion. He's author of 3 scholarly books, the most recent of which is entitled Why Washington Won't Work, which won the Alexander George Award from the International Society of Political Psychology as the best book in the field of political psychology, published in 2015. His second book, Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics, co-authored with Jonathan Weiler, won the Philip Converse Award in 2016 from the Elections, Public Opinion, and Voting Behavior section of the American Political Science Association. In 2004, Marc was awarded the Emerging Scholar Award from the Elections, Public Opinion, and Voting Behavior section of the American Political Science Association. She has numerous published articles on a range of top scholarly journals, and has also won other teaching awards here at the university. We also have Efren Perez. Efren is next to Jacob Hacker. He is an associate professor of political science at Vanderbilt University and co-director of our Research on Individuals, Politics, and Society experimental lab. His research encompasses political psychology and public opinion with an emphasis on racial and ethnic politics. His current research includes several papers on the relationship between language and survey response, as well as new projects on group identity, identity threat, and political response. He has been published also in the top political science journals and has a forthcoming book entitled Unspoken Politics, Implicit Attitudes in Political Thinking. And we also have with us, very pleased to have Dr. Sharece Thrower. She is an assistant professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on how both Congress and the courts constrain the president's use of various policy instruments, such as executive orders, signing statements, rulemaking, and regulatory review. We're very much looking forward to hearing your discussion. Her scholarship has likewise been published in the top journals in political science, and she's currently working on projects examining how changes in legislative capacity over time influence the exercise of presidential power, the duration of executive policymaking, gubernatorial and unilateral policymaking, and testing theories of delegation. So we have a very esteemed panel, all focusing on topics very critical to the issues we're going to talk about tonight. So with that in hand, I'm going to start out by posing a question to Professor Jacob Hacker, and he is going to lead off the discussion. I will pose a question to the other panelists before we move to open it up to everyone else. So, whether one voted for Donald Trump or not, many people feel we've entered uncharted territory with a president with such limited experience with our political systems and our governance structures. So, Jacob, what can you tell us about how we got here, and what we should expect in the coming years for policy making at the federal level, at the governance of our country, well aware of the constraints on making predictions in this context?
Not to mention the 5 minutes that I've been given to speak to this question.
To start us off, yes.
So first of all, if anybody saw me frantically scrambling up here, I just wrote my comments a few minutes ago. Okay. So if those who saw me scrambling up here to write down some last-minute comments, this was not procrastination. I honestly didn't know what would happen in the hour or two before we met, and I wanted to make sure that I had the latest, executive order in mind. Let me just thank everyone who put this together, and especially Carolyn and my fellow panelists, and Shannon, who arranged my trip here, which was actually very smooth, and notwithstanding what's going on in our nation's public life. And I also wanted to note that one of the great things about coming down to Nashville, and there are many great things, is that my brother-in-law and his family live here. And confusingly enough, my brother is named Jacob too. So that caused some confusion in the household. So I I want to talk a bit about the latter part of that question, namely where I think we're going, based in significant part on who we're talking about. Now, I think a lot of the journalism and commentary is suggesting a sort of unpredictable environment, and it's certainly that. But I think it's easy. It's not easy to pin down exactly where the GOP and Donald Trump in particular are going. But I think it is possible to start to sort of see the outlines of an emergent governing philosophy, if you will, that comes out of the various forces we see. And not surprisingly, perhaps, I draw in seeing this on the arguments that Paul, my co-author, who I should thank as well, and I make in American Amnesia, which is coming out in paperback on Valentine's Day, February 14th. Just as you heard all those depressing book titles, and so wouldn't you want to give something like this to someone on Valentine's Day? So in this book, we talk about the decline of effective governance in the United States, and one of the main reasons, or forces that we discuss is the rise of what we call Randianism, after the novelist, those who don't know, this is her, Ayn Rand. Now, by this, we do not mean that lots of people in power read and believed in Ayn Rand, or at least that's not what we meant when we wrote the book. It turns out that a lot of the people at the center of the Trump administration read Ayn Rand novels, and unlike most of us, stopped liking them when they were 19 years old. And so, for example, Trump himself sees himself in the fountainhead. He is Howard Rourke, the architect played by Gary Cooper in the movie, who dynamites a building because it doesn't live up to his standards. And Rex Tillerson looks to Atlas Shrugged for insight. Andy Puzder, not surprisingly, the incoming labor secretary, is a big Rand fan. Mike Pompeo as well. And we all know about Paul Ryan, who was with Ayn Rand until he discovered that she didn't like religion, which is a bit like that quote that was attributed to the Senator Jeff Sessions. I was for the KKK until I found out they were supported marijuana. So yeah, leaving Rand over her lack of religion. There's so much fertile material before you get there. But anyway, what do we mean by Randianism? And I'll be very brief here. We mean a philosophy that combines worship of businessmen, of founts of creativity and prosperity, with a visceral hatred of government, a stark us versus them division of the world into and a stark us versus them division of the world into hardworking makers and freeloading takers. Now, the thing about Randianism is it's neither libertarianism nor old school conservatism. Libertarianism yet has an anti-government philosophy, yes, but it's very skeptical about capitalists because it worries a lot about the ways in which private business actors can use their resources to create what is often called crony capitalism, right? To rent seek, to use the economic term. And it's not like old school conservatism because it's pretty radical, right? It really wants to tear down existing institutions. And I think this has three big implications. The first is that it helps us understand this really peculiar combination of right-wing ideologues and, let's just be honest, often clueless billionaires that Trump has nominated. So the former, like Mike Pence, are the intellectual vanguard, and the latter are the John Galts of policy reform, unsullied by ties to corrupt government, able to bring the creativity of the private sector into governance, and the like. And this is also, I think, a good explanation for why Trump and his team have really done very little to prepare for actual governance. As of January 18th, a shocking 28 people had been nominated for the 690 positions requiring Senate approval. This is, if this continues, heck of a job, Brownie, is going to look like good governance. Second, this diagnosis suggests that there's more common ground within the GOP that is often believed, because the thing about Randianism is it offers a little something to all of the major elements of the GOP coalition. The libertarians get hatred of government and radical decentralization and privatization. The pro-business conservatives get the chance to shower money and power on the job creators, deficits be damned. The more populist elements of the coalition get the us versus them attacks on the takers, both here and abroad: immigrants, criminals, foreign meddlers, welfare cheaters, as opposed to upstanding and, yes, majority white beneficiaries of Medicare and Social Security. And now, finally, it gives us a pretty ugly picture of the type of governance we may get. One that combines giveaways to and fealty towards narrow rent-seeking interests like energy and finance, with a systematic dismantling of federal government capacity and offloading of responsibility to lower levels of government, and finally, a turn towards demonization and division when the first two elements aren't going well as hoped. Now, I want to, after all that, I really do want to end on a somewhat upbeat note. And so let me just say, I think that this approach, while it poses enormous risk, also is likely to result in lots of mistakes and unpopular inconsistencies that can be used to push back against Randian rule. After all, most Americans are not Randians. Witness the response to Romney's 47% comment, or Ryan's backtracking from his statements about the safety nets as, quote, a hammock that lulls able-bodied people to lives of dependency and complacency, drains them of their will, and gives them incentive and of their incentive to make the most of their lives. Ryan has stepped back from those comments because those comments don't reflect the way most Americans think about our society or our government. So there is going to be opportunities to push back against Randianism, and my main message is that those of us who are worried about this drift, and I think all of us concerned about good governance should be, need to know what we're up against. Thanks.
Okay, so now I'm going to pose a question to Marc Hetherington. So, Marc, the public has shown faint and declining confidence in our political system. With a president that has harshly and broadly criticized our political system and public administration at all levels, is there any hope for restored confidence or a better way of getting the work of government done?
No. Well, maybe. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody who's been involved in putting the program together. And even though I really can't endorse buying Jacob's book as a Valentine's present specifically, it actually very much informs my answer to the question. And where I'm going to start is this decline in confidence in government is why we have Trump specifically. This is a key reason for the reason that we have an outsider, a business person, somebody not trained in the arts of government at all as president. And keep in mind, he was not the only Republican in the field who met that definition. So did Ben Carson, who was leading for a while, and so did Carly Fiorina. And basically, so did Ted Cruz, who, as a member of the government, was best known for his reading of Green Eggs and Ham during a filibuster and shutting down the government. So, what Jacob describes as, basically an ideology of distrust that's been put forward by Republicans really now for quite a while. It's not a principled objection to government, but rather just across the board notion that government is incompetent in anything that it could possibly be involved with. When Democrats run it, in particular, is why we end up having what we have. When you think about the several years that led up to the election, this sort of cynical approach to governance was very much on display. Mitch McConnell, of course, famously said a year or two after Barack Obama was elected that his number one job was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. Well, he didn't succeed at that, but he did realize that there were incentives that were built into the process that if he didn't compromise, that if he gridlocked the system in the most cynical way possible, he would probably be the beneficiary. He was the minority leader when he said that. Does anybody know what his job is now? Oh, he's majority leader, and he has been for the last few years. He was handsomely rewarded for this gridlocking of the system. I would add, too, that it's a rational approach to governance in a sense if you're in the minority party and you feel like you can win the next election. Had McConnell and the Republicans made compromises with the Democrats, who would have gotten credit for them? Do you think Mitch McConnell would have? No, Barack Obama would have. So with that in mind, this sort of, in a sense, breaking of the legislative process and using some of the tactics that were used over the course of the last 8 years created the conditions where a candidate from completely outside of politics was attractive. Okay? Second part of the question was, will trust rebound? Now, there are a couple of regularities that I think are kind of interesting for us to keep in mind. We think about the Republicans as the anti-government party, and that's true, except for that Republicans actually trust the government more than Democrats do when Republicans run the government. So my sense is that we'll see a real boost in trust, at least among Republicans in the short to, the next month, 6 months, a year, maybe more, depending upon how things go. Of course, Democrats, they don't distrust government when the Republicans are in as much as Republicans distrust government when the Democrats are in. But they still distrust the government more, especially with the President Trump. It's important to keep in mind that trust and confidence in institutions tend to grow when people perceive the political system is delivering on its promises. So if the public perceives good performance, we could see an increase in trust, at least in the relatively short term. Gains in the economy in particular tend to lead to boosts in trust. And I suspect that Democrats in Congress will cooperate more with President Trump than Republicans in Congress cooperated with President Obama. And the reason is because the Democrats are the pro-government party. They do things. So when an infrastructure bill comes up in Congress, which it inevitably will, we'll see Democrats providing the president votes on those types of things. The president will probably also get his massive tax cuts as well, because Republicans will deal with them on that, even if Democrats don't. So in the short run, one likely outcome in these first however many months is going to be a massive Keynesian stimulus, which could provide for some short-term success in the economy and maybe a boost in trust. In the long term, though, I doubt it will last, and I think for many of the same reasons that that Jacob suggested. One of them is, the probability of poor management is extraordinarily high among a bunch of people who think they know what they're doing, but maybe don't so much know what they're doing. This could lead to all sorts of issues, especially maybe on the foreign front, but certainly on the domestic front as well. And the other thing that I think is characteristic of the political system as a whole, and it's important for us to keep in mind, and it's why Republicans were able to govern as they did for the 4 or 6 years, really all 8 years of the Obama presidency, is Republicans hate Democrats so much these days, and Democrats hate Republicans so much these days, that they'll put up with anything from their own side in order to, stop the other. And that kind of politics filters down to us. It's hard for me to imagine a set of circumstances where Democrats are willing to provide Donald Trump any credit for anything positive that happens, just like it was very difficult for Republicans to provide any credit for a Democratic president when lots of good things happened on the economic front during the Obama years. So, we're kind of stuck. I'm not seeing, the chances for, really big changes in the days ahead. Short term, maybe so. Long term, buckle your seatbelts.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. So now I'm going to turn to Professor Efren Perez. And so what do the voting patterns from the 2016 election tell us about what political parties need to do to more meaningfully engage voters and move away from polarization, if that's possible, which was made evident in this last election? Is there political will to do this in either or both of the parties?
So I come at this general question from a psychological perspective in terms of what is going on in people's minds. And when it comes to polarization, especially political, one of the easiest answers is if it's not going to be along party lines, we're just going to pick some other axis of conflict, really. And I want to make 2 points about that, especially as we move forward on this question as to what drove the results of the campaign and what might drive behavior and attitudes at the individual level going forward. And I want to offer these as hypotheses, not as assertions, right? Because I think it's to be determined in many ways. So the first revolves around a popular notion, especially among journalists, that has to do with white Americans in the US, right? And why it is that they voted, especially those of a lower socioeconomic status. And one of the narratives sort of floated around is that many of these individuals voted for Trump out of aspirational purposes, right? This sort of narrative draws on the notion that these individuals voted like a minority group, right? As a way to better their station in society. But as far as I could tell, this narrative is a little bit unhinged from reality and from the established empirical record. We know plenty about this already. And many of these whites did not vote as members of a minority. They voted as members of a majority anxious about losing their demographic, social, and economic perch in society, right? So I don't think that it was about aspiration. And it's actually important that we get the descriptive narrative part right. Now, not all whites did this because identity is an individual level difference. What that means to the non-practitioner is that we all vary in the degree to which an identity or a category like white is central to who we are, with those who really see it as central to their lives basically driving that type of behavior. That also applies to minorities. So when we look at political behavior and we talk about Black voting behavior, Latino voting behavior, it's not all members of the group driving that behavior. It's usually what is termed the high identifying members of that group. That's just a hypothesis, though. And, you know, like I said, I think it's really easy to submit to empirical testing with actual data, which we're pretty awash in. But the other possibility, another hypothesis, sort of wrestles with the question about whether it was really race that was the driver of the election, and that is actually going to continue to drive interactions at the individual level, right? How we relate to one another politically. So this was certainly the election where if we were going to say race was the main driver, this should have happened, right? Mexicans are rapists. Muslims should be banned. I mean, you could pick purple people. I'm sure he probably said something insulting about them, right? But this was going to be the election where this was going to happen. But I think we sometimes forget that all of us, whites and non-whites, belong to a multiplicity of groups. We have many identities or groups that we belong to: race, ethnicity, gender, family role, and party, right? And I think it's important to remember that elections, including the most recent one, was structured around two main parties, suggesting that partisanship is what helps to explain why it is that people behave the way that they did. This would help to explain female Trump voters. How many times have you heard, how on earth could a female person vote for a guy like that? Because she was likely not thinking of herself as a woman and thinking of herself as a Republican. Ditto to co-ethnics, like, you know, in my ethnic group. Why would Latinos vote for Trump when he said all of that blatantly racist stuff about Mexicans? Because they weren't thinking of themselves as Mexicans. They were thinking of themselves as Republicans, and they were doing their partisan duty. And I think we can go on and on going forward, but let's not forget that partisanship is usually what's in play in politics, right? That's it.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Efren. And finally, to Professor Sharece Thrower. So we all know that Trump has promised sweeping changes in key policy domains, and we're starting to see the evidence of that already, and in how the business of government gets done. So should the public prepare for major life-altering changes in our health, education, labor, and other systems? Or is gridlock of another kind in the offing? Or based on your knowledge, what what can we see that may not lead to this agenda that we see evolving here?
Thank you. I want to start by echoing the gratitude that a lot of my panelists expressed, thanking the organizers and everybody that came out this evening. But to answer the question, given what we've heard on the campaign trail, all the promises that Trump has made, and then how assertive he's been in the last few days with the executive actions, with trying to push his policies forward, I think there's a lot of concerns about how much policy change we're actually going to see, particularly also given Trump's big personality and sometimes his unpredictability. But the point that I want to make is that I think that he's going to be more constrained than a lot of us may think, and that maybe won't get as much policy change as he would want. And this is because of the institutional constraints that he faces from the separation of power system that we live in. And I'll go through a few of these constraints. First, starting with Congress. For any president to be really successful at pushing their policy agenda forward, they're going to need the support of Congress. So while we do have a Republican-controlled Congress, their majorities are small, particularly in the Senate. So, for instance, in the Senate, it would only take 3 Republicans to switch sides and vote with the Democrats to completely flip the majority there. In addition, Democrats can also filibuster. Republicans in the Senate don't have a filibuster-proof majority, so they can block any sort of policy change in that sort of way. In addition to that, we know that the Republican Party has been pretty internally divided for a while now, and that's going to be a barrier in trying to get the whole party to be supportive of President Trump's policies. And in addition to that, we've already seen many Republicans being very hesitant to support a lot of Trump's policies. They might be critical, have policy disagreements with him with the way that he's approaching these things. And then they also have electoral concerns of their own. Their constituencies may not be in agreement with what Trump is doing. And at the end of the day, these members of Congress want to get reelected. And so that might stop them from completely supporting Trump's policies. And right now, Trump is entering his administration with some of the lowest approval ratings that we've seen in a long time. So already we know that he doesn't have the public on his side. And historically, when the president doesn't have the public on his side, he's going to have a hard time getting Congress on his side. And so because of that, Trump is going to have a hard time pushing his policies forward through Congress. And also down the line, we've traditionally seen in every midterm election, the majority party always loses seats in Congress. So it's likely that the Republican majority is not, it might be in jeopardy down the line throughout Trump's administration. But a lot of people may think, okay, so Trump may be blocked by going through Congress, but we've seen in the last few days Trump using a lot of executive actions and people seeing this as a way for the president to get around Congress and maybe implement his will in that sort of way. But the president's still pretty constrained with these executive actions, and there's a lot of institutional constraints in place that are going to stop the president from going too far. So, for instance, Congress can deny funding these executive orders. So, for instance, a lot of these orders, for them to be implemented, they need congressional appropriations. So, Trump talking about building a wall in this recent executive action. He's going to need appropriations from Congress. That's going to need congressional action. And like I said before, that might be difficult to do given the opposition within Congress. Second, Congress can also pass legislation that can retaliate against the president and against these executive orders. So that's also a possibility too if the president goes too far. The president also is constrained by the courts. So when presidents issue executive orders, they have to issue them according to already existing authority that the president has. So authority mostly from statutes passed by Congress. And if the president goes outside of this authority, so goes too far, these executive actions can be struck down by the courts. And so we've seen that plenty of times, with, even under President Obama's administration, his immigration orders being struck down. And so this is going to be a barrier. And the fact that the Supreme Court right now is deadlocked and that it's going to be likely take a long time to get any sort of nominee confirmed, these sorts of decisions on executive power, if they come up, are going to be likely to be resolved in the lower courts, which are more liberal-leaning than we see the upcoming Supreme Courts. And then finally, another way that these executive actions are limited is the executive branch themselves. So the executive branch can prove to be ineffective at implementing the things that President Trump wants, particularly already starting at the beginning of his administration. He's coming towards starting out with a somewhat hostile relationship with a lot of the people within the executive branch. So one of his executive actions, implementing this hiring freeze. Well, at the end of the day, this could put his policies that he wants to put in place in jeopardy, because if he has a hiring freeze, he's not able to have the manpower he needs to implement these executive orders. He may not have the expertise that you want to have from the executive branch in actually effectively implementing these orders into actual policy. And then also the fact that already there's been reports that Trump has mostly relied on his inner circle, and when he's issuing these executive branch actions, that he hasn't actually consulted with agencies widely on issuing them. They haven't been properly vetted. This is something that most presidents have done to make sure that this is, the orders can be properly implemented by the executive branch. And this is something that so far President Trump hasn't done well. And so that might also create some difficulties in implementing these executive orders. And also the fact that he hasn't vetted them properly may leave them vulnerable to legal challenges. That's one of the reasons why you vet them in the first place. So all of this to say is, well, President Trump has been pretty vocal about the sorts of sweeping policy changes that he wants to make. He's faced by a lot of constraints by Congress, the courts, even the executive branch. So while it's hard for me to say how much policy change is actually going to happen, I think that sort of in the long term, it's not going to be as sweeping as he would want it to be.
Thank you, Dr. Thrower. I think before we open it up to the audience, I just wanted to give the panelists, since as Jacob Hacker mentioned, it wasn't really possible for us to fully prepare for what each panelist would say, given it's kind of up-to-the-minute changes in what's happening today. So I wanted to give any of the panelists opportunity to add any comments after hearing what your colleagues had to say.
Well, first of all, I never pass up the opportunity to give comments, and I just want to start off by saying I violently disagree with Marc. I believe that this would be a great Valentine's Day gift. Okay.
Look, I'm just thinking maybe Flag Day. Yeah, I definitely endorse the book.
Okay. You endorse, but you support, but you don't endorse. That's remember that? Okay. So let me just say that we made one really good choice with this book. Our initial title was How the War on Government, American Amnesia, How the War on Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Great. Okay, so just wanted to say two things in response to the really interesting reflections. So first, three things. First, I really agree with Marc that the distrust of government is at the heart of this. And in a way, it's sort of the public side of this Randian turn. As I said, I don't think Americans buy into a lot of this ideology, but they certainly buy into the idea that government is wasteful and inefficient, even if they like some of the, very much, some of the specific things it does. So what I wanted to just speak to really quickly is, first, I didn't say anything about the election and voting. And I just want to say that, and there's a reason for that. In a lot of my work with Paul, I've written about organization and its importance. Now, Trump has shown that campaign organization is not necessarily the be-all, end-all. But if you think about what is the agenda that's going to happen in Congress, the kinds of long-term efforts of the groups like the Chamber of Commerce, the American Legislative Exchange Council at the state level, the Koch brothers and their extensive network. That's really shaped who's in office, what the agenda is in a way that's quite profound. And I think, I guess I disagree a little with Sharece here. I think we are potentially going to see some fairly substantial policy changes in the near term. As Marc said, big tax cut bill is a near certainty. That's a big deal given its fiscal and other effects. I also have been really vexed by what's going to happen on healthcare, but I still think there's a real probability, a real chance of some significant and destructive action. And so let me just note that the filibuster is not relevant in the context of the healthcare debate so long as they can do what they want to do through the so-called budget reconciliation process, which is not subject to a filibuster. And indeed, the Republican strategy is oriented entirely around using this process. The real question that has been at present, so in January of last year, the Republicans passed a reconciliation, through the reconciliation process, a complete repeal of the Affordable Care Act, or essentially all of the things you could repeal through reconciliation, which is essentially everything related to the budget. They can't get rid of the regulations in the law. And everyone has been assuming that Republicans will pursue the replacement part of this simultaneously, as we're now told, or more or less simultaneously, through the normal budget, the normal legislative process, thus requiring Democratic support. I would guess that Republicans are looking out at what's happening and the anger and fear that's occurring across the nation and the degree to which Democrats are digging in and recognizing that if they're going to pass anything that they can call replacement, it's going to be through reconciliation as well. And that means that that what we're likely to see if something gets passed, it's not going to be the Collins-Cassidy or other approaches that involve trying to maintain some of the best parts of the Affordable Care Act. It's going to be something that that is limited to the kind of stuff you can do through reconciliation, which again is taxes and budget and spending, basically. So stay tuned. I would say here, this is an area where the pressure that is brought by us, people concerned about this, will make an enormous difference. And it's particularly these wavering Senate Republicans. I spoke with the staff of Lamar Alexander the other day, and I just note that he is one of the most critical players in this, and should be reminded constantly this is both bad policy and bad politics. So I said nothing about the voting side. I just want to say two things. One is that I don't think we should downplay the degree to which one of the tectonic forces here was the growing split between rural and urban areas in the United States. We're in a blue oasis, and most urban areas have become blue, while the rest of their states have often become red. This is a new and very deep division in not just the United States, but other affluent democracies. Take a look at the vote for Brexit, and then look at a satellite image of the UK. And what you'll see, the places where the lights are at night are the places that voted to remain within the UK. Then look at a map of the United States, a voting map. You will see pockets of blue, pillars of blue. If you look at the population density in urban areas, that's where the lights are. So prosperity is leaving behind rural areas, and the anxieties that we've talked about in terms of race are compounding that. And so I would say the biggest study to come out before this election was not about politics, it was about death rates among middle-aged whites. And the author of that study endorsed this Valentine's Day book. Angus Deaton, he and his wife, Ann Case, discovered that middle-aged whites are dying at higher rates today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. The leading causes of death that have risen are death from opioid overdoses, I think I can't say that, and suicides, liver disease, and then there's also an increase in death rates due to cardiac and other conditions related to obesity. So I just want to say that there are no other group in the United States and no other country where middle-aged citizens have seen death rates rise. And that's a pretty fundamental change that I think is linked up with a lot of the other strains we've been talking about.
Thank you, Jacob. Anybody?
Oh, I'm ready to turn it over to the audience at this point. If you guys would like to.
So yes, the differences across the landscape in how the vote went. I came here from Austin, Texas, and in Austin we used to say we were a blueberry and tomato soup, and I kind of feel like that applies very much to Nashville, Tennessee as well. So what I'd like to say is, so if you have a question, we ask a couple of things. Please ask, since there's many people here, if we give everybody opportunity and you want to queue up a second time, that'd be great, but we ask you to ask one question, to be pointed in how you ask that. So, not a little soliloquy before you get to the question, to give everybody opportunity who wants to talk and give the speakers time to respond. And then just wait for me to cue you to go ahead so we make sure we don't end up having people talking simultaneously because, like I said, we're live streamed. We want to make sure those watching online can also hear what you have to say. You're welcome to come up and also please introduce yourself as you ask the question. If you want to pose a question to a specific panelist, please also identify that panelist. We have Dr. Hacker, Dr. Perez, Dr. Thrower, and Dr. Hetherington. Please address it to a specific panelist if you want to, or generally to the panel. So, would you like to lead off?
I'm Matthew Ramsey. I'm retired now. I was founding director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt. My question is for Dr. Hacker. It would have been a two-part question. The first part would have been, what do you think is going to happen with the Affordable Care Act? I think you've already answered that. The second part concerns the longer-term future. I think many people have said most Americans are covered by employer-based insurance. They shouldn't worry. Of course, there are benefits they received from the ACA, which they're going to lose. Also, fewer and fewer employers, this is a fairly long-term trend, are offering health coverage. More and more often, it's taking the form of flexible reimbursement accounts, which are sort of the equivalent of defined contribution as opposed to defined benefit pensions. They shift risk to the employee. And finally, another trend is the growth of the gig economy. More and more people are on their own, so-called independent contractors. So I'd like to ask you to reflect on those trends and what you see as the longer-term implications of the abolition of the ACA.
Well, so the first thing I would say is that I didn't actually fully answer that question because I honestly don't know. And so I wouldn't presume the abolition of the ACA. But I am deeply concerned. And I think the politics is quite, if not unpredictable, quite volatile. You know,
that's a hypothetical.
Yeah,
if it happens.
A deeply volatile environment for all the reasons that that we've discussed, and also, and I think it's really important. There's a very, very large literature in political science that says something that is pretty obvious to people outside political science, and that is that it's a lot hard. There's a lot more pain and opposition when you try to take things away from people than there is appreciation when you provide it in the first place. This is something I learned quite well when I was trying to get a toy away from my toddler daughter at one point. Where was all that emotion when I gave you this? So let me talk about the longer term trend, because I think you're exactly right. For reasons I've explored in some of my work, we are uniquely reliant on employment-based health insurance. No other advanced democracy has followed the route we have. There is a diverse range of systems in other countries, but they all have in common that they cover all or virtually all people, and that they have some system-wide framework for restraining the inexorable rise of costs. And in all those systems, coverage comes as, in various ways, as a right of citizenship rather than as a right of employment by a particular employer. Now, we've seen a very stable picture for employment-based coverage in recent years after the big erosion during the financial crisis. That's shouldn't blind us to the fact that all the shifts that you were describing have been underway for a long time, and the Affordable Care Act, of course, was designed to try to fill the growing gaps that were left behind. So, 6 months ago, I was writing pieces about how this debate was going to move towards a point where there could be a serious move to resurrect an idea that I first developed called the public option. As the father of the public option, I have watched my child, baby, whatever we want to call it, go through about 9 lives. And I thought perhaps it was about to experience its latest. But I do think that we shouldn't forget that there is a lot of underlying support for the idea that people should be able to have access to the same kind of stable public insurance option with private alternatives within it that Medicare provides to older and disabled Americans. I am struck, I've been doing a lot of qualitative work recently, which is political science speak for talking to people. And I am struck by the number of supporters of Trump and conservatives who say, I hate the individual requirement, I think it's un-American, and I say, well, of course you would not support letting everyone go into Medicare, and they said, that's a great idea. And so I think that if you look at some of Trump's rhetoric around price regulation and the like, I think that there is a surprising degree of latent support for a more robust use of government. We're not going to get there directly, but the zigzag process of policy change sometimes takes us in unfamiliar directions.
Thank you.
I'll pass on the microphone.
Yeah, I think
but
someone's
just
going to go for you.
Two quick footnotes.
Oh, okay.
There are
very quick.
countries that have corporatist systems of health insurance, like France and Germany, basically employer-based, employer and employee contributions, but everybody is covered somehow. And the other footnote is Lamar Alexander is critically important, but I would say he's pretty hopeless. Bob Corker has a much more reasonable outlook at this point on the healthcare issue.
But I do think that Jacob's point that Lamar Alexander is very influential and he is one of our senators, that we, those of us who are really concerned about how this turns out, need to be in touch with our senator. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Yes, please.
My name is Susan Warner. I work at the VA. I'm a physician. I'm struck in this last election and throughout the cycle of campaigning with the role of the media and how this rise of the alternative facts and the way that rural America, which I call the non-Starbucks America, which is how I heard the election divided up, how they are not listening necessarily to the same media that people in the blue centers are, and what we think that can play out, in terms of how our media can work within this environment.
I'll give part of it a go. So one of the things, it's funny, I just assigned this chapter from an old book by an old political scientist who is really thought of as one of the greats, V.O. Key. And it's about public opinion, about what public opinion means. And one of the fundamentals was that we agree on the fundamental facts. That's the only way to make public opinion meaningful. And we are reaching a point where it doesn't feel like that's the case any longer. Now, it's probably important for us to remember that this isn't the only time in history that that's been the case. In fact, if you think about the sweep of American history, a lot of it has been occupied by a partisan press. This was, of course, before our lifetimes, but from the mid-1800s to the early 1920s or so, we didn't have the kind of media that we, as folks who are in our 30s, 40s, up through 80s, experience. Okay, so we've been here before. It's not to say that it was great. Either when we didn't necessarily agree on the facts. it's a real challenge to get back to another time, right? Or this time when we used to have 3 networks and all the news was basically the same. And the reason that that's difficult is the explosion of social media. It's really important to keep in mind that not all that many people watch Fox. Not that many people read Breitbart or what the left-leaning alternatives of those are. But a lot of us, tons of us, use social media. And we get these scrolling pieces of information across our screen. It's just a headline. But if it's endorsed by a friend and our friends tend to be like us politically on average, we might endorse that questionable fact. And it's not necessarily connected to a reputable news organization or whatever. A real central part of why people are willing to believe those things, there are 2 pieces that I think are really important. One of them is this excellent work done by a fellow named Jonathan Ladd who teaches at Georgetown that shows people hate the media. They just don't trust. They don't view the mainstream media as a credible source any longer. If you don't view the folks who, at least according to us, have the facts, then you'll listen to anything. The question is, why people have gone in that direction. And of course, a big part of that, that's fueled why people are willing to believe anything that is negative about their opponents is because they hate them. I mean, they just hate them. If you hate somebody, you guys probably don't hate anybody. I do. There are a few, and I don't want to give them credit for anything. I don't want them to feel good about anything. I don't want them to, you know what I'm getting at. The key thing is that if you distrust and dislike your opponents, you'll believe anything negative about them, and be unwilling to provide them credit for the things that they actually do well. But again, it's really important to remember that this isn't new. We've actually seen this. The 1890s, the 1880s were a lot like that. But of course, it's also probably important to remember that people like Grover Cleveland and Rutherford Hayes and Chester Arthur, were our presidents back then. These guys had great beards. But they were not great presidents, and this is probably not a great time for that.
So I think if you heard President Trump's strategist Stephen Bannon this afternoon attack the media as the opposition. So I think this is going to continue to be a challenge for public perception of the media. So, sir. Next, please. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Henry Goldberg. I am a freshman here at Vanderbilt undergrad. And I was wondering, so right now there is so much that's getting passed through executive actions, through bills that are passed in the House or the Senate, and all of that people are, for good reasons, focusing on like healthcare, Obamacare, and all those sort of big headline things that came up a lot during the election, and rightfully so. Those are the headline issues. However, of course, there's also a lot of other legislation that is being passed, particularly about the United Nations, or that's at least being talked about in, from what I can tell, unprecedented ways. Like, it even happened, 20 days ago or so, I think, when they threatened to defund the entire United Nations based on like one resolution they passed. It was the controversial Israel one. What do you see as being the future moving forward? Do you see any resistance from the people? Because Democrats, for instance, are so tied up, and again, for good reason, on defending Obamacare, that I just don't see any efforts toward helping out the United Nations the same way I do other things that might be gotten rid of, that kind of thing. So what do y'all see happening with that?
I have one thought, and I encourage the other panelists to chime in. Institutions like the United Nations are, in the view of folks who supported Donald Trump, they're the problem. So the UN is the problem. The people who run the EU in Brussels, they're the problem. It's these coastal intellectual elites who really don't understand the importance of borders and nationalism and these types of things. They're accountable to nobody. These types of organizations, they're the problem. So is there going to be a movement afoot, among ordinary Americans or members of Congress to, support these, extra-governmental, organizations that, do play important roles, NATO, so forth? Don't hold your breath on that one. I don't see, absent a crisis of some sort, and that could change things. I don't see, again, I see these types of organizations, both here and in Europe, as being perceived as the problem.
I'll just add one quick thing, which is completely consistent with that, which is that I think that in a lot of areas we're going to face these sort of twin problems. One is that we take for granted a lot of features of governance, both domestic and international governance, that have made our lives a lot better. And in fact, in American Amnesia, Paul and I write at one point that the headline you never read is "Things are getting better slowly because of government," right? It's just not. I mean, your eyelids are drooping already, right? So we take for granted the fact that these international institutions built on the foundation, as my wife has argued in a forthcoming book, which is not available on Valentine's Day, based on the foundation that war is not a legal means of redressing disputes, that these have made our world far safer. And despite all of the things that we see, including internal conflicts and terrorism, interstate conflicts are way, way, way down. And lots more people are alive today because of that. And it's good for us, right? I think not to be pulled into such interstate conflicts, it would, if only we wouldn't throw ourselves into some or create some, but that's another story. So I think that the difficulty is that not only do most Americans not appreciate this and vastly overstate how much it costs, right? And this was true in the Brexit fight as well. In fact, a survey done in 1994 asked people what the two largest items in the federal budget were, and number one was welfare, and number two was foreign aid. I won't even go into why that's wrong. So not only that, but I think there's a real difficulty here. The America First doctrine slogan is expressing a real sense that people have. The difficulty is understanding why the United States shouldn't get its own set of rules in this system. And this isn't just a Republican position, right? I mean, this is a huge issue for those who want to engage in humanitarian actions that involve military force but don't involve sanction by the UN Security Council as is required. And this came up in Libya, it comes up in other contexts. And the reason I think that we have to accept these rules and we can't have special rules is that everyone else wants to have special rules too. In particular, people like Vladimir Putin want special rules, and he thinks he's got them because he violated these clear rules in taking Crimea. So I just put that out there, that to allowing people to understand how important it is to our own security and welfare that these rules be broadly applied is something it's a challenge that that those who believe in them will have to confront.
I can add that I take encouragement from your generation. We saw how you voted. It was pretty clear in electoral maps. And I also see that your generation is kind of more globally aware. You travel around the globe. You get these perspectives that, America first could actually be bad for America. What we do and how we affect others, whether it's on trade, whether it's on, health-related things that NGOs do. I mean, we heard today about also action to defund efforts that international organizations are undertaking. So I share your concern, and you guys are my hope for the future. We need to get you voting in larger numbers.
Oh, but you are all our hope.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, I'm Becky Ray. I was recently made aware, this was through cable TV, not anything like Fox. I guess I wouldn't be here if it was. That there have been 2 significant changes made in Voice of America, the radio broadcasting service that has been limited to international broadcasting. One is that they've been granted a domestic frequency to broadcast in the United States. And the second is that they have changed their way of oversight or governing that radio capability. It was previously a nonpartisan board of governors, I think that's what they called it. And they have now changed that through the Defense Appropriation Bill to eliminate the board of governors and is now governed by a CEO, which is appointed by the president. It is a federally funded radio service, $800 million, and was reported that there are now 2 CEOs, co-CEOs, and they are young people, which is good to know that they're people concerned about government in their 20s, but they're in their 20s, and they were former participants or organizers in the Trump organization. So they're appointed by the president, and it just concerns me that, I'm shaking, concerns me that, you know, we're seeing the start of propaganda. So alternative facts is propaganda, limiting who gets to take questions at press conferences, who will be given permission to attend the White House press conferences. And it's really frightening. So I just want to raise that because I had heard nothing about Voice of America.
Does anyone on the panel want to?
What channel is it?
MSNBC, Rachel Maddox, last night.
Did anyone on the panel want to comment?
I'll just say that I share your broader concern. I'm not necessarily that worried about Voice of America. If I wanted to influence a large number of persuadable voters, I definitely wouldn't start a radio program. But I think it's indicative of a much more troublesome and larger set of developments. And so I'm in the business of recommending books. I'm going to recommend a book soon to emerge from my colleague in the Yale History Department, Tim Snyder. I don't know what the title will be, but it was based on a really great op-ed he wrote that was entitled 20 Things That You, Yes You, Can Do to Stop Fascism. And it's based, I mean, he's a historian of fascism, and it's based on the idea that there are actually, you know, some real patterns that emerge from the history. So pick it up when it comes out and do those things.
Hello, my name is Dakota Simpson. I'm also an undergraduate here at Vanderbilt. I want to thank each of you for coming out here. My question is to Dr. Perez's point about polarization. I come from a very Republican-leaning district, and now I attend college at a liberal-leaning university. Had a very unique perspective throughout this election that's given me frustrating insight at times, but it was an insight which is helpful. So a long-term trend in politics that no one can ignore is this polarization and this tribalist nature of grouping ourselves within these subgroups. So my question is, what are actionable steps that we can do to reverse this as a citizenry? Because my concern is that we now seek information and, we now seek affirmation instead of information.
So that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm going to give you a complete answer, right? But some of the quickness with which we sort of attach ourselves to these groupings has to do with that alacrity, right? That we actually don't slow down, that we take it, sorry, that part of the reason why these group attachments take hold is that they're based on the fact that we just fly through our decision making, right? So we're not exactly encouraged to take a step back, right? To think, what does it mean to have alternative facts, right? And this isn't just in people's heads, right? It's partly seared into how we structure politics. So part of my answer actually goes back to this woman's point earlier about alternative facts and what was going on. One way to look at it is that what we're actually encouraged to do as individuals is to be right at all costs rather than to get it right, right? And in psychology, that's a trade-off known as sort of accuracy versus partisan goals. Now, in a political system, what do you think is being privileged, right? Partisan goals. And so that means that subtly but powerfully, we're actually encouraged to express opinions to go and engage in a type of reasoning that puts our party in the best possible light and the out party in the weakest possible light. Now that happens because we have actually very little incentive to slow down and think about whether that's the correct course of action. So if you're wanting actionable steps, it's the difference between sort of what is known as sort of fast and frugal decision making and more controlled and deliberative, right? And some of that actually, I imagine, will come from people like you who are just a little bit more motivated to want to get it right. That doesn't mean you're not partisan. It means that you actually might slow down a bit, right? You might question. But what we do institutionally to encourage, to tilt that balance, right, a little bit more toward accuracy rather than partisan goals, you know, I'm not so sure what that is, but I would say that it's not entirely up to the mass public. Some of it is the leaders that we have in Washington, right? Some of it has to do with what exactly are we expecting out of them if, rather than telling us, let's try to get this right, they simply sort of get out of the way and let us have at it in terms of partisan animosities, right? So it's a bit of a sort of complex problem to tackle, but like I said, it's not all in people's heads, right? Some of this is people's psychology catching up to what's happening institutionally.
I wonder if I could add one thing. I don't know whether this would work or not, but if you're thinking about like day-to-day, you know, steps that one might be able to take, talking to somebody, and it sounds like you're probably in a terrific position to do this. Talk to people who you don't agree with. You know, I think one of the things that used to be different about politics before, you know, we started to sort ourselves out in the way Jacob was talking about, regionally, country versus city, you know, that type of thing. People who disagreed politically lived on the same block, you know, and so you realize that, you know, the other side wasn't a bunch of monsters, but instead, you know, were decent people who just, you know, disagreed about, you know, various different things politically. You know, one of the things that I think comes with a lack of contact with the other side is a kind of prejudice and stereotyping that, you know, one might recognize as it relates to race or sexual orientation when you're not familiar with that group or something along those lines. In fact, there are studies that have been done recently by Shanto Iyengar and some of his co-authors that show that the propensity to stereotype by party is even stronger than by race, you know, these days. So how do you get over that? Well, you know, one of the ways to get over it is to have more contact with those who are on the other side. One of the assignments that I've assigned this year, and we'll see if it bears any fruit, is in my political parties class, I've assigned people an assignment where they have to interview somebody who disagrees with them and give them a sense of that they're not nuts, you know, they're not bad people, it's just that they have a different perspective. And learning, you know, that, you know, your political opponents, just because they disagree with you about one or two things, or maybe a lot of things, doesn't make them bad. You know, it's just that they're different.
Thank you.
If I could, I wanted to add to something that Professor Perez was saying about some of this coming from our leadership. And so one thing that we could do is think about things that have reinforced this partisanship in our leadership. So things like gerrymandering, redistricting, and campaign finance laws. So these are things that we can put pressures on our members of Congress about and get involved in organizations. I know these sound like very large issues to deal with, but I think getting involved and being vocal with our representatives are one way to start to let them know that polarization at the leadership level is something that may not be acceptable anymore.
Hello, my name is Mark Trussler. I'm a PhD student in political science here. So I couldn't help but think if we had this panel on January 26, 2016, someone would have asked, do you think Donald Trump's going to be president? And we would have laughed. And all the political scientists up there and me as a political scientist would tell you a story about why that couldn't happen and how the institution of the Republican Party would have prevented that from happening. So I have a question to Professor Thrower. What institutions are you now worried about?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask, because throughout this whole thing, I've been pretty confident in our separations of power system. So I haven't really been worried about, I know maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I'm pretty trustful that there'll be proper checks on each branch of government. I know right now everyone's worried about excessive executive power, but I'm pretty confident in our other branches of government that they're able to check these sorts of excesses of executive power. So I don't know. I wonder if the other panelists had thoughts on this. I'm pretty optimistic that I'm not worried really about any branch of government particularly.
I don't share that optimism. But let me go back. So let me say something that's going to surprise everyone here. I met Donald Trump in September of 2015. And I did because I was asked by someone at the School of Management who's writing a story about his candidacy for Fortune magazine, whether I wanted to come along. And to which I said, of course not. But then I told my co-author, Paul, and he said, are you crazy? This is, you should go. So I went, and I went to Trump Tower, and I went up, and I met the family, and met Trump. And I explained to him exactly why he could not win the presidency. And needless to say, not only was I wrong, but I was wrong in talking to the man who proved me wrong. So that said, I would, in retrospect, look back and say, okay, at that time I was wrong because I really underestimated the degree of fragmentation within the party. So that's something. So the primary race, the primary campaign, played out in a way that I did not expect, but probably should have figured out, right? Which was the fact that there was no coalescence. And the Party Decides, this book that was written a few years back that said that party insiders can use various tools to kind of make sure that their chosen candidate is favored. Well, the party didn't decide. Now, on the other hand, if you go and look at the fundamentals models that just based on who's in the White House, i.e. which party's in the White House and how long it's been in the White House, what the economic situation is, what the approval ratings are of the president in office, but don't look at anything about the candidates. They were generally predicting either a totally tied race, and some of them gave the Republicans a slight edge. Why? Well, because we just had 8 years of Democrats. Even though the economy was doing far better in local historical terms, relative to the longer span of history, those were not impressive numbers when you plug them into the models. And the Obama's approval ratings were while rising, were still middling. And so I think, and the diagnosis there would be basically under those circumstances, an argument for change is more likely to be received well. So I think sometimes we overanalyze these things. And I think one thing that I didn't appreciate at the time, but in retrospect seems to be true, is that that Clinton made herself a kind of a system affirming leader, right? She basically was saying, look, we need to pull together to say that this man is outside the mainstream of American politics. He violates the norms of American politics. In a way, right, since a lot of people really dislike American politics and government, there were people who are on the margin, not hardcore Republicans, who I think were swayed to some extent by this simple argument, not, put aside everything else, but by the simple argument that we need to do something to shake things up. Let me just say why I'm not as confident about the separation of powers. Because I think if we've learned over the last generation, and this is something that Marc has really shown well, is that the separation of powers works really much less well in a context of extreme polarization. And let's just not beat around the bush. It works particularly badly when one party can stop governance without being accountable for that. And that's been the strategy of the Republican Party, as Marc said, right? And so you're right, we have a different kind of separation of powers threat today. But I think the system has shown itself to be fragile in a variety of ways. And I'm less confident, I have to say, about its capacity to deal with some of the strains that we're facing. So I have ideas about how to reform that, but I'm going to stop. So.
Okay, thank you.
So I have one thing I did think about that I was worried about is it's not more so like the excess of power of one branch of government that I'm worried about. I'm actually worried about the inefficiencies of the executive branch. I think that could be a big threat given the way that Trump has been proceeding in like the hiring freezes and his relationship with agencies, particularly careerists in the agencies, where the expertise that we should rely upon in actually implementing policies in an effective way. So I'm actually worried that it's going to be inefficient and ineffective, which could stall the way that policies are being implemented. So that's my one concern.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions that we're going to take, and I ask you again to be kind of as direct as possible in the question because we want to fit them in and also let I want to have time to thank everyone who contributed to this event and also our panelists and let Dr. Hacker also enjoy his dinner plans with his family tonight. So we're going to stay on time. So I think you're the mic. Yeah.
I'm Alice Sanford. I'm a retired Latin teacher, and I have been calling my senators until they no longer took calls. Busy, busy, busy. Then I started sending them emails. In particular, from Alexander, I'm getting very badly written form letters. Mm. There are things that are being, to my way of thinking, torn apart that are going to be very hard to put back together. I saw a list of 17 agencies that are being considered for defunding, among them NEA and even perhaps more critically NEH. These are, I think, quite vulnerable and very much a part of what makes the United States a beautiful, wonderful, tremendous and great place for all citizens to have some access to things that make us all a little bit more human. Do you have any ideas about how we as citizens, assuming that there is a complete gridlock and that these things are no longer going to be part of a government, what can I call it, a government rainbow? What can we as private citizens do to try to maintain some of what we've seen as important?
Okay, so before we take that question, let's hear your question too so that we can then take them and make sure we get both questions in.
Okay, my name's Deanna Rye. I'd like to know to what extent the panel thinks that the disaffected white rural voters who put Trump in office, that the level of venom in this election with respect to Hillary as a woman, the signs at the Trump rallies, I mean, to what extent does simple sexism about that first woman running apply? And also the white lash against President Obama being the face of our nation for the last 8 years. those angry white voters, as we've seen, as they've crawled out from under the rocks and carried signs and gone all over social media, I mean, there was a lot of just sexism and racism in this election, was there not?
Okay, you can take one or both, or respond as you wish.
I'll try to take a stab, and a beginning one actually, to both. So the first one is what you seem to have a lot of, in some ways that's great, is time, right? But I think, to think about pressuring elected members, to bend ever so slightly toward your preference or preferences, I think involves not only time, bodies, money, right? It involves organization, right? So some of that is not entirely up to you, but what you might be able to do is to actually thread together the beginnings of a more coordinated effort. So let me give you a sort of a personal example, right? So I have been worried a little bit about what's going to happen with this possibility of massive deportations. I don't consider myself a bomb thrower by any stretch, right? But if that were to pass, what can I do, right, to contribute to an effort like that? Well, some of the handwriting on the wall is that protests might be some of it, but some of that battle is going to be won sort of over airwaves, right? The kinds of narratives that we're going to spend to try to win hearts and minds, that takes money, right? That means organizing fundraisers. That means tapping on people that can pull levers, right? So I might not be at the protests, but I may actually be doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work that you sort of just described, which involves getting on the phone with the right people and I guess start toward the beginnings of a campaign, right, that is either anti-something or pro-something in that regard. It's just, I guess what I'm saying is that it's hard work, and you probably have to do just that much more at you as an individual, but in concert with like-minded individuals. In terms of the role of sexism, where is the lady? I actually found it quite strange that explanation did not get more play during the election. In some ways, it was the kind of explanation that we wanted to say, that's too base, that's so blasé, we don't do that anymore. And yet, the relationship between men and women is one that sort of has existed for millennia, right? How could something like gender bias just go away magically? It wasn't discouraged. Quite the contrary, I actually think that if it wasn't actively encouraged, at least people got out of the way and said, hey, if you want to say those kinds of things, I'm not going to say it's okay, I'm just not going to sort of slap your hand, right? And that's tied to sort of the question of racial prejudice and something else. So for me, what's sort of puzzling is why we ask whether, these well springs of intolerance mattered or not. I mean, I think the real question is, was this something very broad, sort of, something like Marc has a lot of expertise here, something like authoritarianism, right, or ethnocentrism, right, sort of these deep reservoirs of animosity writ large, right? You just dislike lots of types of people, right? Or was it much more specific, right, targeted toward females, targeted toward Latino immigrants, targeted toward African Americans? And I think, your intuition is right on about, we just sort of were at the very end of 8 years of the first African American president. And what we know empirically is that was an era where we were very largely polarized along racial lines, with things like prejudice doing a lot of the heavy lifting in explaining why we supported or opposed certain policies, like healthcare, for example, right? Why would race have anything to do with healthcare? It had everything to do with it, right? And I'll stop there.
So let me also, there was a young man in a nightcap. Did you want to ask your question quickly? Did you want to give the last? We may not be able to spend much time answering, but I didn't want to leave the very last question out.
Yeah, I have like a simple question. Like, my name is Dino Pupo, and I'm a student here in this university. And my question is, due to the current worldwide political tensions, how likely is it that the Third World War occurs during like Donald Trump's presidency?
Well,
I guess one of the things that that I'll just try to put that question together with the one about funding, certain different types of organizations, and also just like the language, that ended up being so central to the campaign. And I think the thing that concerns me as much as anything is this breakdown in norms. We have norms on the one hand, that generally govern, the things that we do, and they're informal, but they're, socially understood, and we enforce them on each other. So you don't say some of the things that were said at Trump rallies. You don't do just certain things. You don't filibuster every piece of legislation or threaten to filibuster every piece of legislation that comes before the Senate. And then there are rules. These formal rules that are the things that are the last sort of defenses against certain things. And rules, when they have to be used all the time, turn out to be relatively weak. It's norms that are the things that allow us to, be a civil society. And we see this in the international arena, this lack of concern about internationalism and these international organizations and trade agreements and things along those lines that have allowed us to have stability and to thrive in certain ways. And these things are all kind of under attack on one level or another, forcing, rules to try to govern things that they were never designed to govern. And I find that to be the most concerning thing. We used to be able to kind of count on certain things because people wouldn't do that because it would be a violation of norms. Along the lines, and that oddly I think fits into your question about, the concern about like a really serious, military engagement. We would never go there. Well, if it's all about rules and pushing your advantage as hard as you possibly can, to, shake the biggest deal or best deal that you can out of an adversary, maybe we do, and that's frightening.
Jacob, you look like you want the last word.
Well, I don't know if I want the last word, but I definitely want a word. So I just say, so let me just thank everyone for coming. This is really stimulating. In response to the question of what can be done, I just want to add on to Efren's really good points. So 3 things. One is there's a lot of research suggesting that calling your member of Congress is the most effective way to influence them. It's not that they're going to answer the phone, it's that you shut down their phone lines and then they know something big is going on. Trust me. 2, the organizational story, that's absolutely right. And in the short to medium term, it's stuff as simple as showing up at town hall meetings. Remember the Tea Party protests? This stuff really matters, and it matters enough that you should be showing up at town halls and doing other things that make your voice heard and make your cause visible. And then finally, thinking a little bit more long term. I think it's really worth remembering this election was so close that we could come up with plausible explanations based on sexism, racism, and that explain why Clinton lost. But it wouldn't explain why so many state houses and state legislatures are in Republican hands. It wouldn't explain why it was very likely that Clinton would be facing a Republican Congress. I was talking before the election about the potential of the Republicans turning into a zombie party that was just saying, "Eat Hillary brains." But it was a really good line. Unfortunately, I can no longer use it. But in any case, but that just is a driving home that organizationally, those who share some of the goals of the opposition to Trump are not very well distributed. Nationally, organizationally, it's not a dense organizational network. And yes, there's also, of course, the fact that we have a profound asymmetry in the media world. So I'm not talking about having Democrats or liberals form their own parallel organizations, but I am talking about recognizing that to win political fights, people have to show up. Woody Allen said that 90% of success in life was showing up, and in politics, it's probably like 99%. So you got to show up, and you got to think for the long term.
Thank you. I want to thank some people who contributed very importantly to this event. Mike Baker at the back of the room there, Mike Wave, he is our Scholar Strategy Network fellow, and he was kind of my right-hand man helping to organize this event. And Shannon Meldon-Corney, Shannon, can you stand up? Did a whole lot of groundwork for this event. We also looped in at the last minute Fatima Ali and Kelsey Stolzenbach. Stand up, ladies, stand up, to help with the event. And importantly, I want to thank our speakers. Jacob came all the way from the East Coast just for this event and is headed back tomorrow. We're greatly appreciate this. It's a very important part of the Scholar Strategy Network. And so we're very honored to have him with us. And as you can tell, we have stellar scholars here in the Vanderbilt Political Science Department. The Vanderbilt Political Science Department has been wonderful in supporting these kinds of events and engagement with the public. So we thank the Department of Political Science and Marc Hetherington and Sharece Thrower and Efren Perez for being here tonight, for taking the time that they did for you. You know, this is not a paid speaker event. They're here to do their job of
That's why.
So, thank you again for coming, everyone. And to our sponsors, yes, yes.
A small question.